When Amish women get married, their lives change in ways most outsiders never realize. Community rules govern everything from clothing choices to business decisions. These aren't suggestions, they're binding expectations that reshape a woman's entire existence. Dress requirements. Marriage brings immediate and permanent changes to how Amish women must dress, with community ordinances that control every aspect of their appearance. Married women must abandon any colorful clothing from their single years, switching to darker, more subdued colors that signal their settled status. Head coverings become mandatory at all times in public, with specific styles that indicate their married state to the entire community. Work restrictions. Community ordinances strictly limit the types of work married Amish women can perform, with violations resulting in church discipline and social consequences that affect entire families. Certain professions become completely forbidden after or involvement in mainstream business practices that might compromise traditional values. Teaching positions, healthcare work, and retail employment often end with marriage vows. Women cannot work outside the home without explicit husband and church approval, creating economic dependence that reinforces traditional family structures. Self or other activities that align with domestic responsibilities while supporting family economic needs within approved community frameworks. Financial control. Marriage transfers financial decision-making authority from that limit women's economic independence and property ownership. Bank accounts, property ownership, and major financial decisions require husband approval or joint ownership arrangements that ensure male authority over family economic matters. Women cannot make significant purchases, investments, or financial commitments without appropriate male oversight. Business ownership faces strict limitations, with married women required to demonstrate that entrepreneurial activities and potential limitation if they're deemed harmful to spiritual development or community values. Social activities must align with traditional expectations about married women's roles and responsibilities. Travel restrictions require husband permission for trips beyond local community boundaries, with overnight travel, particularly who left or were shunned, faces strict prohibition, creating social isolation from previous relationships. Church submission. Religious authority structures create binding obligations for married Amish women through ordinances that require submission to church leadership and community spiritual authority without question or compromise. Church discipline applies differently to married women, with punishments affecting entire families when violations occur. Spiritual counseling, confession requirements, and community service obligations increase after marriage as women assume greater responsibility for family spiritual welfare. Religious instruction participation becomes mandatory, with married women required to attend additional church meetings, Bible studies, and spiritual education sessions that reinforce traditional teachings about women's roles and community expectations. Questioning church authority or community decisions becomes grounds for discipline that can result in social shunning, family separation, and community exile. Married women must demonstrate complete acceptance of religious teachings and community spiritual guidance. Ministry participation follows strict gender limitations, with married women restricted to appropriate supporting roles that don't challenge male spiritual authority or traditional church hierarchy. Speaking opportunities, leadership positions, and spiritual counsel remain limited to gender-appropriate activities within established religious frameworks that maintain traditional authority structures. Family planning. Community ordinances control reproductive decisions and family planning through religious teachings and social expectations that prioritize large families over individual choice or personal circumstances. Birth control use faces restriction or prohibition, depending on community interpretation of religious teachings about natural family planning and divine providence in reproductive matters. Modern contraceptive methods may be forbidden entirely, with community discipline for violent birth methods that align with religious teachings about divine providence. Adoption decisions. fertility treatments, and reproductive health care must align with community religious interpretations and social expectations. Family planning discussions involve church leadership, guidance, and community oversight that ensures decisions support traditional values about family size, child rearing responsibilities, and women's primary roles as mothers within established cultural frameworks that emphasize large families and natural reproductive patterns. Education barriers. Educational opportunities for married Amish women face significant restrictions through community ordinances that prioritize domestic responsibilities over intellectual development and limit access to knowledge that might challenge traditional values. Formal education typically ends with marriage or shortly thereafter, with community expectations that learning should focus on domestic skills, child-rearing knowledge, and religious instruction rather than academic or professional development that might conflict with traditional roles. Reading material faces scrutiny and potential restriction, with community guidelines about appropriate books, magazines, and educational content that align with religious teachings and traditional values. Libraries, educational institutions, and learning opportunities outside community boundaries may be prohibited. Adult education, continuing education, and skill development programs require community approval and must demonstrate restrictions based on community evaluation of appropriateness for married women's traditional roles. Educational opportunities must support rather than compete with domestic responsibilities and community expectations about women's primary functions within traditional family structures. Business ownership. Entrepreneurial activities for married Amish women face strict community regulation through ordinances that ensure business ownership supports rather than challenges traditional family structures, and gender registration and legal ownership often require husband involvement or approval, with community oversight, ensuring that entrepreneurial activities remain secondary to domestic responsibilities and family obligations that define traditional women's roles. Customer interaction, business travel, and professional relationships must align with community standards about appropriate contact with outsiders and business practices that maintain traditional values while generating family income through acceptable means. Partnership agreements, business contracts, and professional commitments require community evaluation for appropriateness and potential conflict with traditional gender roles and family responsibilities that take precedence over entrepreneurial success or financial independence. Employee management, business expansion, and professional growth face limitations when they conflict with traditional expectations about women's primary domestic roles and community obligations that define appropriate activity for married women. Financial independence through business ownership may face community resistance if it challenges traditional authority structures or creates economic competition with husband income that might disrupt established family hierarchies and gender role expectations. Business success must demonstrate support for traditional values rather than personal achievement or individual accomplishment that might conflict with community teachings about humility, family priorities, and appropriate women's roles within established cultural frameworks. Community discipline. Enforcement mechanisms for community ordinances create powerful incentives for compliance through social, economic, and spiritual consequences that affect married women's violate community ordinances, creating social exile that extends to children, extended family, and economic relationships that make independent follows established procedures that include confession requirements, community service obligations, and public acknowledgement of violations that create lasting social consequences and family shame that affects multiple generations. Economic consequences include loss of community, business relationships, cooperative work arrangements, and mutual aid support that provides essential economic security during emergencies, medical crises, and seasonal agricultural challenges. Family separation may result from serious violations, with community pressure on husbands to demonstrate appropriate authority and control over wives' behavior through disciplinary measures that align with traditional teachings about family hierarchy. Community leadership intervention includes counseling, supervision, and ongoing monitoring that restricts freedom and independence while ensuring compliance with established ordinances and social expectations about appropriate behavior. Social isolation extends. Movement beyond community boundaries requires explicit approval through ordinances that control where married Amish women can go, when they can travel, and under what circumstances they can leave their immediate community area. Overnight travel requires husband permission and often community leadership approval, with detailed explanations of purpose, destination, and expected duration that ensure travel supports rather than conflicts with traditional family responsibilities and community obligations. Transportation arrangements must align with community standards about appropriate travel methods, escort requirements, and contact with outsiders during travel that maintains traditional values and prevents exposure to outside influences that might challenge community teachings. Business travel faces additional restrictions and oversight, and traditional gender roles that take precedence over professional or economic opportunities. Medical travel for healthcare needs requires approval and often community escort arrangements that ensure medical decisions align with community religious teachings and traditional approaches to health and healing that may conflict with modern medical practices. Family visit permissions depend on community evaluation of relationships, destinations, and potential influence of outside family members who may have left the community or adopted different lifestyle choices that conflict with traditional values. Emergency travel situations require immediate community notification and approval processes that ensure even urgent situations receive appropriate oversight and guidance from community leadership and spiritual authority. International travel faces strict prohibition in most communities, with rare exceptions requiring extensive community discussion and approval processes that evaluate spiritual and cultural risks associated with exposure to outside influences and different cultural values. Medical decisions. Healthcare choices and medical decision-making face community oversight through ordinances that prioritize traditional healing methods and religious teachings over modern medical practices that might conflict with spiritual beliefs. And community values. Medical treatment decisions require husband and often community approval, particularly for procedures that involve reproductive health, mental health treatment,